In 1951, a British explorer named Eric Shipton stumbled upon a line of footprints high in the Himalayas. Prints that looked human, but were not. Each one was nearly 13 inches long, pressed deep into the snow, as if made by something heavy and alive. But almost 19,000 feet up, in a place where even oxygen starts to give up, what kind of being could survive there? That single photograph of those footprints traveled across the world. Newspapers printed it, scientists argued over it, and suddenly, an old Himalayan legend had a new face. Tonight, we are going to talk about that creature, the Yeti, the Abominable Snowman, a legend that refuses to die and that still challenges everything we think we know about nature. Before Shipton, before cameras and expeditions, the Yeti was already old. The earliest written hints of it go back almost 900 years to a Tibetan Buddhist text called the Mani Kambam. According to this text, Tibet was once a vast lake. As the water slowly receded, mountains rose, forests appeared, and life began to spread. On one of these mountains lived Sinmo, a wild rock ogress seen as an incarnation of the goddess Drolma. She met a compassionate monkey, an incarnation of the bodhisattva Chenrezig. Over generations, some of their descendants changed. They became less like monkeys, more like humans. Those became the first Tibetan clans, but not all of them completed that journey. Some remained wild, hairy, and powerful, somewhere between human and beast. Those, the legends say, are the Yetis. For Tibetans, the Yeti was never just a monster hiding in the snow. It was a creature of the mountains that could bless or punish. Monks in remote monasteries told stories of Yetis that guarded sacred valleys and punished people who disrespected the land. In temple art and old scrolls, you can still see them. Tall, upright figures covered in dark or reddish hair with long arms and a narrow head, watching from the edges of icy peaks. Some stories describe them as gentle creatures. Other stories are much darker, but one thing was even stranger, and it was this: Tibet was not alone. Across the entire Himalayan belt, from Nepal to Bhutan, from Tibet to the forests of China, people describe a being that sounds strangely similar to the Yeti. The Sherpas, who live on the southern slopes of Everest, have used words like Yeti or Metokangmi for generations. Some of these names can mean things like rock animal, snowman, or man-bear. In Nepal, people use names like Banmanche or Murka, meaning forest man or wild man. In Bhutan, the creature is called Migoi, which can be translated as strong man. Folklore says Migoi can walk through snowstorms, turn invisible, and serve as guardians of sacred places. The belief is so strong that Bhutan even created the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary, originally said to protect the habitat of the Migoi as well as other rare animals. And then there is China. In the deep forests of Shenangjia in central China, people have spoken for centuries of the Yeren, the wild man. Records from as early as the 16th century mention hairy, human-shaped figures that steal livestock, raid villages, and vanish into the trees. Some older Chinese texts describe beings that look human, covered in hair, that walk upright, throw stones, and sometimes even speak in strange, bird-like voices. This isn't the pattern of a single myth spreading outward. This is the pattern of multiple isolated cultures describing something they all believed was real. So now, the question becomes even more uncomfortable. If civilizations separated by deserts, mountains, borders, and centuries all encountered a similar being, were they all hallucinating the same creature? Or were they all seeing something that modern science hasn't fully explained yet? By the early 1900s, the Yeti was no longer an isolated mountain legend. It had become something else entirely. The spark actually began in 1921. When British explorer Charles Howard Berry led a reconnaissance mission to Mount Everest. While trekking at nearly 20,000 feet, his team noticed a trail of large human-like footprints in the snow. When he asked his Sherpa guides about them, they replied with a familiar phrase, Meto Kangmi, the wild man of the snows. Howard Berry believed the prints were probably made by a wolf or large animal. But when he mentioned the term Meto Kangmi during an interview, a journalist made a crucial mistake. He mistranslated the Tibetan word meto, meaning man-bear, into the similar-sounding word mek, meaning filthy. And just like that, the filthy snowman turned into the Abominable Snowman. A name so dramatic and cinematic, it spread through newspapers like wildfire. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, magazines across Europe and America published stories about a mysterious Himalayan creature. No photographs, no physical evidence, just rumors, footprint reports, and secondhand sightings. But the world was hooked. By 1950, the legend had grown so large that even reputable scientific groups were quietly funding expeditions. The Himalayas, remote, unexplored, and nearly impossible to navigate, felt like the perfect place for something unknown to survive. And then came 1951, the year everything changed. British mountaineer Eric Shipton, while scouting a new route up Everest, spotted a line of footprints on the Menlung Glacier at roughly 19,000 feet. Each print was 12 to 13 inches long, broad, clearly defined, and spaced like something walking upright. Shipton placed his ice axe beside one for scale and photographed it. Those photographs went global. Newspapers across Europe and America were running headlines about the Abominable Snowman. Expedition funding poured in, and suddenly the world wanted something more than stories. They wanted proof, and the Himalayas, to everyone's surprise, seemed ready to provide exactly that. The first shock came from Pangboche Gompa, a 17th century monastery in eastern Nepal. Monks there claimed to possess sacred relics passed down for centuries, a scalp and a severed hand said to belong to the Yeti. Travelers described the scalp as cone-shaped, covered in reddish fur, and unlike any known Himalayan animal. The hand, kept in a small wooden box, had long blackened bones and thick dark skin stretched over its knuckles, disturbingly human, but not quite. The relics became famous after local monks told climbers that they came from a gentle Yeti who once cared for a meditating monk named Sangwa Dorje, bringing him water, food, and firewood. In 1957, wealthy American oilman Tom Slick organized one of the most ambitious Yeti expeditions ever mounted. He sent brothers Peter and Brian Byrne deep into Nepal to investigate the Pangboche relics. The monks allowed the men to examine the hand, but refused to let it leave the monastery. So Peter Byrne made a decision that remains one of the strangest episodes in Yeti history. He removed one finger from the relic, replaced it with a human finger, and then smuggled the original out of Nepal. Hollywood actor James Stewart, who happened to be in Calcutta, agreed to help. His wife hid the Yeti finger inside her lingerie, slipping it past customs without a second glance. From there, the finger traveled to London, where scientists finally examined it. The result was anticlimactic but important. The bone was human. Not monstrous, not ape-like, human. Another monastery in Kumjung possessed a Yeti scalp, a conical dome of fur stored in a wooden chest. In 1960, fresh off his Everest fame, Sir Edmund Hillary led an expedition specifically to investigate it. His team took samples, ran tests, and found that the Yeti scalp was made from the hide of a siro, a Himalayan goat antelope. Again, not what the world hoped, but explorers didn't give up. Between the 1960s and 1990s, expeditions from Japan, Russia, the US, and the UK returned with clumps of hair, tufts of fur, and plaster casts of footprints from across Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan, and Sikkim. Each time, local people swore the remains belonged to the Yeti. Yet when scientists analyzed the samples, the results pointed again and again to familiar animals: Himalayan brown bears, Asiatic black bears, siraus, yaks, and occasionally wolves. Still, the world wasn't ready to let go, because amidst all these disappointments, the footprints kept coming. Mountaineers kept reporting encounters. Sherpas continued insisting the creature was real. For scientists, this created a problem. If the relics were fake or misidentified, then why were the reports so consistent? That's when researchers began searching for a biological explanation, something grounded in evolution and anthropology. One of the first bold ideas came from Dr. Grover Krantz, an American physical anthropologist. After examining the famous Shipton footprint and other casts taken in Nepal and Bhutan, Krantz proposed a dramatic theory. The Yeti could be a surviving relative of Gigantopithecus, a giant ape that lived in Asia between 2 million and 250,000 years ago. Fossil evidence proved Gigantopithecus existed. It stood over 10 feet tall, weighed more than 1,000 pounds, and roamed forests in regions that overlapped with the Himalayan foothills. if even a small population survived into the Ice Age and retreated into the mountains. Krantz argued it could explain centuries of sightings. The problem, of course, was the fossil record. No bones, no teeth, no remains of Gigantopithecus had been found above 2,000 meters, let alone in the harsh, high-altitude zones where Yetis were reported. And without skeletal evidence, most scientists dismissed the idea as too speculative. So researchers turned to another possibility, something far more grounded in reality. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, zoologists studying Himalayan wildlife began pointing out something crucial. The region is home to 3 different bear species: the Himalayan brown bear, the Tibetan blue bear, and the Asiatic black bear, all of which can rear up and walk short distances on 2 legs. In melting snow, their overlapping paw prints stretch into long human-like tracks. Many early Yeti photos showed exactly these distorted patterns. Even Edmund Hillary's zoological team concluded that several alleged Yeti relics matched known bear species. It was the first real scientific hint that the Yeti legend might have a biological root. That shift set the stage for one man to take the investigation further than anyone else. Reinhold Messner, one of the greatest mountaineers in history and the first person to summit Everest without oxygen. In 1986, Messner claimed he encountered a strange upright animal while trekking alone in Tibet. It wasn't human, it wasn't a monkey, and it didn't behave like any bear he had ever seen. The sighting pushed him into a years-long investigation that took him across Nepal, Bhutan, and the Tibetan Plateau, interviewing llamas, herders, hunters, and forest dwellers. What he found was startling. Every community described the creature in nearly identical terms: a nocturnal, solitary, foul-smelling animal that avoided villages but could become violently territorial when surprised. Herders showed him dens carved into ice walls, exactly the kind used by high-altitude bears. Hunters pointed to claw-marked trees and overturned stones that matched known bear foraging patterns. Across the entire region, the descriptions aligned almost perfectly with the behavior of a real animal. The Himalayan brown bear, particularly a rare high-altitude variant known to be unusually large, aggressive, and adapted to walking upright for brief periods. Some had conical heads, some stood over 7 feet tall when rearing up, and some, in low light or heavy snow, could easily be mistaken for a hominid. Many scientists agreed. The Himalayan brown bear had one of the most genetically isolated populations on Earth, and its behavior was poorly studied due to the extreme terrain. Even today, researchers still know very little about how these bears behave at elevations above 15,000 feet. But Messner's conclusion didn't answer everything. It didn't explain the Tibetan manuscripts describing beings with human-like footprints and conical skulls. It didn't explain the Mongolian stories of the Almas, which behaved more like a proto-human than a bear. It didn't explain the Sikkimese Banjakri, small human-like spirits with reversed footprints. It didn't explain why multiple cultures across Asia, separated by mountains, borders, and centuries, all described creatures that were human-shaped, not bear-shaped. And most importantly, it didn't explain the footprints. Footprints like Shipton's, with clear toe impressions and bipedal strides taken at nearly 19,000 feet, where no Himalayan bear had ever been documented. Something was missing, and by the time the 1990s ended, scientists realized that a creature living in such isolated, dangerous terrain couldn't be solved by folklore or anthropology alone. They needed science, hard science, DNA, genetics, molecular analysis, the kind that could answer the Yeti question once and for all. Researchers around the world began collecting what they believed were Yeti hairs, small tufts found near caves, tree hollows, mountain passes, and frozen valleys across Nepal, Tibet, Ladakh, and Bhutan. At first, each sample brought hope. Thick, coarse strands that didn't match goats, hair with unusual medulla patterns, fibers found in areas where no livestock lived. Local Sherpas insisted some came from Dzute, the huge bear-like Yeti that roamed above the snowline. Others said they belonged to Meitei, the more human-like version reported in ancient manuscripts. But when the hair was sent to labs, something unexpected happened. Nearly every test pointed to known animals: Tibetan blue bears, Himalayan brown bears, Asiatic black bears, yaks, goats, and even a yak-cow hybrid called a Dzo. Still, scientists weren't satisfied. They needed a comprehensive study, something large enough to answer the question once and for all. That moment arrived in 2013 when Dr. Brian Sykes, a respected Oxford geneticist known for his work in human ancestry, launched what became the largest Yeti investigation in history. He made a global announcement: send me every alleged Yeti sample you can find. Hair, bone, skin, teeth. And the world responded. Sykes received 57 samples from museum collections, expeditions, government archives, private collectors, monasteries, and Himalayan locals. Out of these, 36 were viable for mitochondrial DNA testing, a method that traces maternal lineage and survives well in old or degraded specimens. The results changed everything. Most samples again belonged to familiar animals: bears, horses, canines, goats, and cattle. But two samples stood out. One came from Ladakh in northern India, the other from Bhutan, deep in the remote eastern Himalayas. When Sykes compared their DNA to global databases, they did not match any modern species. Instead, they matched the genetic signature of an ancient polar bear that lived between 40,000 and 120,000 years ago. This sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Had a prehistoric hybrid species survived in the Himalayas? A remnant population of an ice age bear roaming at altitudes above 15,000 feet? A creature so rare that locals mistook it for something part human, part beast? For the first time in history, science was not rejecting the Yeti. It was facing a mystery deeper than expected. But science demands replication, and that came 4 years later. In 2017, a team led by Charlotte Lindqvist, a molecular biologist from the University at Buffalo, collected 9 new Yeti samples: bones, teeth, hair, and skin from monasteries, caves, and high-altitude regions where sightings were common. The conclusion? The samples belonged to Himalayan brown bears, Tibetan blue bears, Asiatic black bears, and one sample from a domestic dog. So, did this disprove the Yeti? Not exactly, because while none of the samples matched an unknown hominid, the DNA revealed something far more interesting. The Himalayan brown bear and Tibetan blue bear had some of the most genetically isolated lineages on Earth. These were populations shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in extreme isolation, separated by glaciers, ice walls, and cliffs no human had ever crossed. In simple terms, the Himalayas are still hiding animals science has barely studied. Animals we didn't know existed until the last decade. Animals with genetics so unique, they once mimicked a prehistoric polar bear. And if unknown bear lineages could survive undetected for millennia, what else could? This suggests that the Yeti story was never just about a creature, it was also about the environment that could hide such a creature, a region so extreme that it bends the rules of nature. The Himalayas aren't just mountains. They're one of the least explored ecosystems on the planet. Entire regions remain unmapped, unreachable, and biologically unknown even today. Between 1998 and 2018, scientists documented over 360 newly discovered species in the eastern Himalayas alone. These weren't fossils. They were living animals no one had ever identified. Among them were 10 new mammals, 17 reptiles, 58 amphibians, and nearly 100 insects. Some were so localized they existed only in a single valley, sometimes only on one mountain slope. This is the Himalayan pattern. Species appear suddenly and disappear just as quietly. Isolation created dozens of microhabitats, turning the region into an evolutionary laboratory. Over 10,000 plant species grow in the Himalayas, and 4,000 exist nowhere else on Earth. And that's not it. The high-altitude zones have never been surveyed because the terrain is too dangerous. Even helicopters struggle to fly at those altitudes, making scientific access nearly impossible. When researchers did reach some remote regions, they found animals with genetic signatures so unusual, their DNA looked older than the species themselves. This is what caused the 2013 ancient polar bear anomaly. Not because it was a polar bear, but because Himalayan brown bears evolved in extreme isolation, forming a lineage unknown to science. But in this discovery, science answered one part of the mystery, but not the whole thing. Because if the Himalayas can hide unknown bear lineages for tens of thousands of years, who's to say a Yeti couldn't exist there too? And these were not rumors, not legends, they were officially documented encounters, logged by explorers, photographed by climbers, and reported by militaries. One of the most significant came in 1899 when British explorer Lawrence Waddell was traveling through Sikkim. At nearly 17,000 feet, he found a trail of enormous footprints in fresh snow. During World War II, an RAF pilot flying over Tibet reported seeing two tall, upright figures walking in deep snow on a remote ridge. Then came 1953, the year of the Everest summit. Tenzing Norgay, one of the two men who first reached the top of the world, spoke openly about finding huge footprints on earlier expeditions. Sightings continued into the late 20th century. In 1972, a Japanese climbing team on Mount Makalu photographed a tall figure crossing a snowfield upright. The images were analyzed in Japan and labeled inconsistent with bear locomotion. The reports were not limited to the Himalayas. In 1991, Russian scientists in the Altai Mountains, home of the creature they call almas, photographed large, human-shaped footprints with pronounced toes and a clear heel. They measured nearly 40 centimeters long. Their official conclusion, not bear. Even in recent years, the encounters haven't stopped. In 2007, an American trekker in Nepal filed a written report after seeing a tall, fur-covered figure running upright at sunset near Langtang Valley. And in 2019, Indian Army mountaineers posted photographs of a new trail of large footprints, 32 inches long, found near Makalu Base Camp. These prints made global news and were later acknowledged as unidentified by the Indian Army itself. And yes, the Nepalese government once issued official Yeti hunting permits. In the 1950s, foreign explorers could pay 5,000 rupees for permission to search for the creature under strict rules. It could be photographed, captured, but never killed. Taken on their own, each sighting could be dismissed. But together, spread across a century, across multiple countries, across people who didn't know each other, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. These weren't random hikers or tourists. These were trained climbers, explorers, soldiers, pilots, forest rangers, and villagers who grew up in the shadow of the mountains. And the strange thing is, their descriptions overlap more than they contradict. A tall, upright figure, covered in dark or reddish hair, a conical head, a terrible odor, and footprints, always footprints, that defy every known animal in the region. Maybe the Yeti is not a creature we've forgotten. Maybe it's a creature we've never fully understood, because the Himalayas are vast. They are deeper than our maps, older than our science, and far more mysterious than we admit. If there is a place on Earth where something ancient could still be alive, it is here. And perhaps that's why the legend refuses to die. Not because people want to believe, but because something, somewhere in those frozen valleys and untouched forests, keeps giving them a reason to. So I'll leave you with one final question. If you were standing on a silent Himalayan ridge at dusk and you saw a tall figure watching you from the tree line, would you call it a bear? Or would you wonder if the Abominable Snowman is still out there? If you enjoyed this mystery, give this video a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe, because next week we're heading even deeper into the world's strangest creatures.